His is not a river, but a mineral. It sits in you and makes you heavier. And when I bent over the birth certificate, the first thing I felt was not sorrow or rage, but a strange adjustment in my spine, as if the room had shifted a few degrees, and the furniture I had known all my life had slid an inch closer to the wall, and I put my palm flat on the kitchen table to steady the paper, because hands remember how to be useful long after the heart is tired. My name is Eleanor, which is a name that smells like starch and cedar, and the starch dissolves before the cedar, and I am 81 years old, living alone above the harbor where the gulls complain year-round, and where, on Sundays, the water throws back the face of the church so faithfully you can count the shingles. I have the kind of small apartment a widow earns by paying each bill on time and never asking for a favor. I was remember really happened. Deeds and cards and a ticket stub from a January when the heater failed and we pretended the movie house was a cabin. And I told myself that all I was doing was sorting papers for the lawyer, so that when my body decides to be done. I found the certificate in a fresh envelope, a recent copy my daughter must have ordered for some insurance or office matter without telling me, because Lydia tells me many things, but not the things that burden her story with unmarketable facts. And, even when we speak on the phone, her voice is the voice you use when you are backing out of a driveway, attentive but elsewhere, careful not to hit anything, unwilling to stop. The paper was state-issued, clean and undecorated, the way bureaucracies believe truth should look when, really, truth hardly ever looks pressed. It was all boxes and headings and neat lines, and in one of those boxes, the past had been rewritten, like a polite note. Derek's name printed where I remember blankness, and a nurse who couldn't meet my eyes, and a clipboard that felt like a verdict. There it sat, blue and confident. Not even a whisper of an asterisk to say the universe had hesitated, and if there is a cruelty worse than lying, it is lying with beautiful manners. I stood at the sink and poured the boiling water over the tea leaves as if heat could make reason rise. And I watched the curls turn the color of tobacco and rain. And I said his name out loud, not the way I used to say it into the fabric of his shirt. Long moment, I had the old foolish urge to pick up the phone and ask my daughter, who must be somewhere between deadlines and the tight smile she wears around them, how exactly she had persuaded time to shift its hips for her convenience. I know the day of Lydia's birth the way some people know their own face, not because it was a day of triumph, but because it was a day without witness. The air in the hospital had a vinegar brightness. My knuckles were raw from gripping the rail. The nurse wore a pin shaped like a violet and spoke like a girl disguising fatigue as authority. And when the baby came, the woman at the desk asked a question in a voice that was both routine and embarrassed. Father's name. And I told her there wasn't one, at least not one the state would accept, because my husband had already been removed from the calendar by a June that was both longer and shorter than the others. And the man who held the bag of ice to my neck that night had only ever held my hand at funerals, and once, just once, in the bright lunacy of grief, my waist. You cannot put that onto a line. You cannot fit a fog into a box. You cannot ask a new mother who is also an old widow to summarize the year her soul went stiff and then melted into a shape she could carry. And so the father line stayed empty. And I learned how to hold my child with both arms and no ring, how to answer questions with a shrug that was not indifference but self-preservation. After Derek died, the world taught me how to be polite to my own absence. I returned the casserole dishes. I learned the names of the men in the mortgage office who did not look at me but at the papers I sorted for them. I grew a second skin for my voice so it could travel to offices and come home without dirt on it. And I told Lydia stories about her father that were true in spirit, if not always in weather. Because a child deserves a map, even if the cartographer is crying, and if, in certain seasons, I let the neighbor Paul carry groceries up the stairs and once fix the window that shook in high wind. Well, that is not an admission I owe to anyone, least of all a paper clerk with a stamp. Lydia liked order even as a girl. She was the child who put her dolls to sleep in a neat row, with their feet aligned, who corrected adults on the names of birds, who once brought home a list of rules she had written for our lives, numbering them carefully and taping them to the refrigerator so the cold air would keep them crisp. Perhaps I taught her that. Perhaps grief taught us both that arrangement is a kind of spell. Perhaps she discovered on her own that people prefer a story with smooth edges, and they are willing to call it truth if it will not scratch their hands. When she grew up, Lydia found work that rewarded this madness for tidiness, and in offices with glass walls she became expert at making small storms look like rain rehearsals, brushing the messy hairs off other people's reputations. For years I watched her comb the world, and I wondered what part of her, too, wanted to be combed. And as she climbed higher, she began to use a tone with me I recognize now as expediency, dressed as care. The tone that says, "Mother, I'm thinking of you." And also, "Mother, could you not exist so loudly?" The night before I found the certificate, she had called about a charity gala and the dress code, and whether I might consider wearing the pearls because they photographed better. And I had said yes because you do not teach a child generosity, and then refuse to practice it when it is inconvenient to your pride. After we hung up, I sat by the window and watched the harbor turn its lanterns on, and I thought of the 3 good men in my life, one dead, one brief and kind as a summer shower, and one I never met because he exists only as a question Lydia has never allowed herself to ask. And I said to the glass, which never interrupts, that truth gets old too, but has the decency not to powder itself. So when the paper showed up with Derek's name standing on its 2 blue legs where there had once been an honest gap, I felt it not only as a correction to a line, but as an accusation against the year that made me a mother and an orphan of marriage at the same time. And I understood with a clarity that did not ask my age for permission that my daughter had not simply flattered the past. She had audited it, and that the audit included me. If you erase a father, you do one harm, but if you invent one, after burying him, you commit a second. You declare the witness unreliable. You take the woman who kept the stove standing when the rent wobbled and you push her voice through a sieve until only the parts that match your upholstery remain. The certificate lay before me, and in its modesty was an arrogance I could taste. It said that paper is stronger than pain, and that boxes are nobler than breath, and I almost laughed because here I am, a citizen of a century that loves documentation and distrusts memory. And I have spent so long paying bills and renewing licenses and signing lines that say I am who I say I am, that I forgot perhaps that I could also say who I am not. I rinsed the cup and set it upside down on the towel and thought of the lilies we brought to Derek's funeral, their smell like a clean punch, and the minister who could not reconcile our youth with our sorrow, and so preached as if we had borrowed grief from our elders and would return it by autumn. I thought of the letter I never mailed to Paul, telling him thank you for the way he stood in the doorway that winter and asked if we needed salt for the steps. A letter I wrote in a hand so shaky it looked like seaweed, then tore up because widows are expected to be grateful but never hungry. You think one thing at 81, and then the next thought is longer, and it contains all the years you stood up when no one wanted to hear chair legs scrape. I thought of Lydia's hunger, too. A different kind. The hunger for immaculate surfaces. For a narrow breaks and scatters beads under the furniture where you look for them on your hands and knees and call that devotion. I do not know yet, I told the empty room, whether I will call her today and ask the question she has built a life to avoid. Because the day you ask a grown child to tell you why she cannot live inside a truth you survived, you accept that love is not the same as agreement, and that motherhood, which was once a body's work, becomes a jurisdictional dispute between memory and myth. I only know that the minute I saw Derek smuggled back into a document he left by dying, I felt an old stubbornness stretch its legs like a cat, and I remembered the summer after the funeral, when the landlord raised the rent, and I sat at the table and taught myself how to subtract rage from numbers so the check would add up. And I looked around my little kitchen. The room smelled of oversteeped tea and salt and the faint metal of the radiator, even though it was spring. Beyond the glass, a gull perched on the rusted ladder of the pier and tried to shout the tide into obedience. On the chair by the door hung my cardigan with the wide pockets where, if I am honest, I used to keep small cookies for Lydia when she was small. Contraband sweetness in a life that insisted on vitamins and lectures, and I touched the wool and felt not the past, but the present. The stubborn warmth of a thing made to endure. I folded the certificate back into its envelope, but I did not put it away, because some documents belong on the table like an argument you are not finished having, and I wrote Derek's name on a scrap of paper and placed it beside the kettle as one might leave a note for a husband stepping out to the shed. Not because I believed in ghosts, but because I believed in courtesy, even for the dead and even for the truth, which too often in this family has been treated like an old chair. We keep it for sentiment. We never sit in it. And then one day someone paints it white and swears it was always that color. I called her that same afternoon, not because I wanted to, but because silence is heavier when you know someone is already rehearsing their version of the story. Lydia answered on the third ring, her voice too bright, the kind of brightness that sounds lit from the wrong side, and before she could ask about my health or my prescriptions or whether I'd eaten, I said it. I have the new birth certificate you ordered. There was a pause, not long enough for shock, just long enough for calculation, and then she said, "Oh, that. Some paperwork for the estate lawyer. Nothing important." I could hear the clicking of her keyboard in the background, the murmur of office conversation leaking through her headset. She was working as she lied. "They must have filled it in automatically," she added. "You know how these systems are now, everything digital. Things get imported from databases." I told her gently that databases do not resurrect the dead. She laughed, the small, sharp laugh of someone who has mistaken embarrassment for control. "Mother, you're overthinking it," she said. "It's just a piece of paper." But I know how paper behaves. It's never just anything. It's the only thing people believe when memory starts to wrinkle. I asked her who had signed it, and she said, "It doesn't matter," which in our family has always meant it matters enough to hide. I wanted to stop there, to let her keep the polished surface she'd built, but the words came out before I could fold them back inside. "He's dead, Lydia," I said quietly. "He was dead a year before you were born." She didn't breathe for a full beat, and then she said, "I know that, Mother. obviously. I just didn't want to confuse anyone at the firm. At the firm, the firm, the firm. She said it like a prayer, as if those glass walls could absolve her. I asked what could possibly be confusing about a birth certificate that told the truth. She sighed, the sound of a daughter deciding her mother is a sentimental liability. "You don't understand how these things work now," she said. "People Google everything. My name, my background, my family, it all comes up. I just needed it to be clean, that's all. Clean. The same word I once used when I scrubbed her muddy shoes before church. The same word Derek used about his conscience when he confessed that the test results had come back positive, and we both pretended for a week that hope was a kind of medicine. Clean, as if truth were dirt. She said she had to go into a meeting, but would call later. She didn't. I made dinner out of habit. Half a boiled potato and a slice of toast, but couldn't swallow. The kettle whistled at intervals, reproachful. I sat in my chair and listened to the harbor traffic, the engines and gulls weaving into something that sounded like conversation. And I thought of Derek's hands, the way he held a pen like it might run away if he loosened his grip, and how proud he was to sign our mortgage papers himself, and how, in the end, all those signatures still couldn't keep him alive. I imagined Lydia sitting at her desk, surrounded by screens, deleting me one field at a time, and wondered if she'd felt the smallest tremor of conscience as she typed his name into a form labeled Father. If she'd paused at all before hitting submit. If there was even a box for guilt. The next morning, I called the county records office. The clerk, a man with the tired courtesy of bureaucrats who have seen every version of grief, told me that amendments require authorization. By whom? I asked. By the person listed as the child, he said. And verification of identity, of course. Sometimes people add missing details. Missing details. I gave him the dates. He paused. "Ma'am, according to our system, the amendment was processed last summer." I thanked him, hung up, and stared at the wallpaper that had faded to the color of diluted oatmeal. Last summer, Lydia had come for her annual visit, the one she schedules between conferences. She brought me a silver photo frame with a preloaded family picture, the four of them on a sailboat, her husband with his easy grin, their two children squinting at the sun, and Lydia in a white hat that made her look younger than her daughter. She had asked if I wanted a copy. I'd said no, the sea didn't suit me anymore. She'd laughed and said, "Then let it suit me." Maybe the certificate had been changed that week while I was making soup, and she was in town handling errands. Maybe she'd already decided that the woman who birthed her was too untidy to stand in the same genealogy as her clients. Maybe she believed it was an act of protection. It doesn't matter which. Betrayal, like rust, looks the same no matter what color paint it grows under. The days after that blurred into each other like pages that got wet and stuck. I went through old boxes, searching not for proof, but for memory. I found Derek's last letter, the one he wrote in April, shaky, but legible. "If the baby is a girl, tell her the world will ask her to be polite when she should be brave." I folded it back carefully and wondered what he'd think now of a daughter so polite she'd erased him to maintain the symmetry of her success. I kept remembering small things, the shape of his handwriting, the smell of his wool coat, the way he'd once said that the truth is like a candle. It only lights what's around it, never the whole room. I'd built a life on that light, dim but sufficient. And now my own child was trying to replace it with fluorescent certainty. The more I thought of it, the more I realized that what she'd done was not an error, but an inheritance. I had raised her to respect order, to fear scandal, to clean her mess before anyone noticed. She'd just applied the lesson too well. 2 days later, Lydia called again. "Mother, are you still upset about the document?" she asked in a tone that implied the problem was my reaction, not her action. I told her I wasn't upset. I was simply awake. She said, "I didn't mean anything by it," as if falsifying the foundation of a life were a social faux pas. I told her, "The truth has meaning even when people don't mean anything by their lies." She went silent, then asked, almost pleading, "Can't you just let this one go? For me?" I thought of all the times I'd let things go for her. The arguments I swallowed. The money I loaned and never asked back. The hours I spent watching her children so she could attend those galas where she introduced herself as Lydia Ainsley. Because it sounded more refined than her husband's name. And now she wanted me to let go of history itself. I told her I would think about it, which was my way of ending a war without surrendering. That night, I couldn't sleep. The clock ticked too loudly. The harbor lights flickered through the blinds like a heartbeat that couldn't settle. I thought of calling Paul, the man who was there that year, the man who helped bury Derek, who brought groceries and silence in equal measure. But I didn't even know if he was still alive. I imagined what it would sound like to hear a familiar male voice call me by my first name again, without the edge of pity. And then I realized that maybe Lydia had changed the record because she couldn't bear the possibility that she herself might be built on an untidy kindness. Maybe the falsification wasn't only for appearances. Maybe it was self-defense against the suspicion that her father was not the saint I painted him to be, that he was human enough to die, and that her mother was human enough to find comfort afterward. I lay there in the half-dark and admitted to myself what I had never said aloud, that perhaps I had loved Paul, if only for a season, and that Lydia's birth was as much his gift as Derek's memory. But love, like proof, decays when you hide it for too long, and I had hidden it so well that even my daughter, with all her databases and polished lies, couldn't locate it. In the morning, I decided to see the document for myself, the original one. I took the bus into town, a slow ride past closed stores, and the same fishermen arguing about bait. The records office was on the second floor of a gray building that smelled of disinfectant and ink. The clerk looked younger than my granddaughter, hair slicked to one side, polite, but not curious. I gave him my name, Lydia's, the year. He typed, frowning slightly at the screen. "We can't show you her file," he said. "It's sealed for privacy." I leaned closer, lowering my voice until it felt like a secret between conspirators. "I'm her mother," I said. "She amended her birth record. She wasn't allowed to." He hesitated, glancing at the door behind him, then whispered, "Technically she can, if she's the registrant. But it does require a supporting document." "What kind of document?" "Usually a death certificate, or sometimes a marriage record, depending on the correction." "So she used his death certificate to add his name?" He nodded, uneasy. "That would do it." I thanked him, though my mouth had gone dry. The irony was almost theatrical. My husband's death had become her proof of his life. She had raised him from the grave with a clerical trick. I walked out into the sunlight that had turned white and sharp, and for the first time in years, I felt something like anger, not as a blaze, but as a clarity, a line drawn straight down the center of the day. On the bus home, a child sat across from me eating a lollipop, his tongue stained red. He looked at me with that unashamed curiosity children still possess before shame becomes their second language. "Are you somebody's grandma?" he asked. I used to be, I said, and he nodded solemnly, as if that made perfect sense. When I reached my stop, I didn't go straight home. I walked to the cemetery instead. The gate creaked. The path was slick with moss. Derek's headstone was small, understated, the way he'd wanted it. The inscription had faded at the edges, the carved letters filling with dirt. I knelt carefully, brushed the soil from his name, and told him what our daughter had done. My voice didn't shake. I told him she'd made him alive again, on paper at least, and that in doing so, she had killed something else. The small, fragile honesty that had lived between her and me. The wind picked up, and I thought, absurdly, that he was laughing, not cruelly, but with that deep, amused sigh he used to give when Lydia, as a child, tried to explain how clouds worked. "You should be proud of her," I said aloud. "She's learned how to fix what isn't broken." I stayed there until the shadows stretched across the graves like long exhalations, and then I stood, slow and careful, and walked home with the strange calm that follows after an earthquake when you realize your house is still standing, but the foundation has cracked. That night I took the certificate from the drawer again and laid it beside his letter. I stared at both names, Derek Ainsley, Lydia Ainsley, and wondered where mine fit anymore. Paper doesn't recognize mothers unless they are unwed or absent. Our existence is implied, not recorded. I thought about all the years I'd spent making room for her ambitions, how I'd let her curate me into a kind of ghost she could admire from a safe distance. Maybe this was simply the next step. The official version of me retired from her story. Yet beneath the ache there was a flicker of resolve. If she could edit the past, so could I. Only I would do it honestly. I would write it down, every contradiction, every kindness, every mistake. I would not let my silence be her evidence. And that thought, small and stubborn as a weed through concrete, was the first breath of rebellion I'd felt in 40 years. For 3 days after that visit to the cemetery, I drifted through the apartment as though the walls had been repainted in invisible ink, and I could no longer read the rooms. Everything familiar looked suddenly rearranged. The teacups seemed too delicate, the photographs too posed. Even my own handwriting on grocery lists looked rehearsed. Grief does not shout at my age. It tidies itself, folds its sleeves, and begins to sort drawers. I told myself I was cleaning, but what I was really doing was preparing for departure, not from life, not yet, but from the version of it my daughter had printed in blue ink. I made small decisions that felt like breathing. I canceled my subscription to the local paper that mostly printed births, deaths, and the occasional parade announcement. I stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I began walking. The movement helped me think, and thinking, I discovered, is not the same as remembering. It is remembering without anesthesia. Each step loosened something that had hardened inside me. By the 4th afternoon, I knew that if Lydia could invent a past convenient for her, then I was allowed to choose a present that suited me. I started with the file box, the one where Derek's letters and the old mortgage papers lived. I removed the contents one by one, reading slowly, not for sentiment, but for evidence of continuity. There was our marriage license, his death certificate, a receipt for the headstone, and then the stack of correspondence from the year between his diagnosis and Lydia's birth. I had not. In one letter he wrote, "If the world asks you to choose between truth and kindness, pick truth. Kindness can grow back. Truth cannot." I had forgotten that line, or perhaps I had buried it deliberately, because living by it would have meant telling. our daughter more than she could bear. I read that night, I dreamed of the hospital corridor again. The smell of antiseptic, the sound of a mop wrung out, the nurse's shoes squeaking like timid mice. In the dream, I was walking toward a door marked Records Office, and when I pushed it open, the clerk behind the counter had Lydia's face but Derek's eyes. She smiled and said, "We corrected your life for clarity." When I woke, the taste of metal in my mouth lingered. Dreams are not prophecies, but sometimes they are rehearsal notes. I decided then that if my daughter's comfort required a rewritten origin, I would keep my own copy of the truth. Paper had betrayed me once, but it could also protect me. The next morning, I went downtown to a small shop that still sold typewriter ribbons and archival folders. The owner, a woman my age with hair the color of fog, asked what I was preserving. I told at home, I cleared the kitchen table and began typing. Not memoir, not confession, but a record. The dates, the letters, the faces, the weather on the day Derek died, the sound of Lydia's first cry. The keys clacked with mechanical honesty, each stroke an act of resistance against deletion. I worked until evening, when the sky turned the color of diluted ink. By then I had 10 pages and the beginnings of a pulse I hadn't felt since I was 40. When Lydia called that night, her voice had the strained politeness of someone trying to speak through gauze. "Mother, I've been thinking. Maybe we should plan a visit, clear the air." I said that the air in my apartment was already clear, that perhaps she should come when she was ready to breathe without performance. She hesitated, then said, "You're being dramatic." I nearly laughed. If telling the truth is drama, then she has built an entire career as a playwright. Before hanging up, she asked if I'd found any of Derek's things lately because she wanted to digitize family history. I told her I had only found his silence. She did not know what to say to that. After that call, I realized the quiet worsening had begun. It wasn't dramatic. There were no slammed doors, no threats, but a steady thinning of connection. Lydia stopped calling altogether, and when I left a message on her birthday, she replied with a text 2 days later, "Thanks, very busy. Love you." I stared at the words, "love you," without a subject. Even love now was written in the passive voice. A month passed, then 2. The gulls changed their patterns over the water, and the light in my apartment shifted toward autumn. People think loneliness arrives like a knock. It doesn't. It seeps under the door, polite, almost apologetic, until you notice the floorboards swelling. I filled the hours with errands that did not need doing, with books I'd already read, and with letters I would never send. One afternoon, I went to the library to return a book and saw Lydia's photograph in the local magazine displayed near the counter. The article described her as a professional who values family tradition, mentioned Derek by name as her late father, and even quoted a line I recognized from one of my own letters to her, something about resilience, without attribution. I felt both amusement and nausea. To the world, she had become a woman built from borrowed sentences. I left the library without checking out anything, carrying only the dull weight of recognition that my daughter had replaced me not by malice, but by design. In her story, I was already redundant. That evening, the phone rang again. This time it was her husband, Tom, whose voice was always slightly apologetic, as if he were continually compensating for being the second choice in his own marriage. He said Lydia was worried about me, that I seemed fixated on the past. I told him the past was fixated on me and refused to be ignored. He said she thought it might be good for me to move closer to them, maybe into a residential community with support. I asked him what kind of support he offered his wife while she rewrote her birth record. He didn't answer, just cleared his throat and said, "She only wanted to protect you." I thanked him for his concern and hung up. The kettle began to whistle again, as if reminding me of the rhythm of living. By the next morning, I knew I had to change my own geography. If Lydia could redraw lines on a certificate, I could redraw them on a map. I took a bus to the neighboring town, one of those places that used to be industrious but now survives on nostalgia. The streets were lined with second-hand stores and bakeries that smelled faintly of sugar and defeat. I walked into a small real estate office and asked about monthly rentals. The young agent blinked, surprised. "Are you moving, ma'am?" she asked. "I'm relocating my memories," I said, and she smiled uncertainly, as people do when they sense something sane underneath madness. By evening, I had signed a short lease for a modest one-bedroom above a florist. The landlord, a widower named Harold, handed me the keys with a look that was equal parts curiosity and pity. I packed that night with a calm efficiency that frightened even me. The typewritten pages went into a folder marked unedited. I left behind the couch, the dishes, the photographs of family trips where I had been cropped at the edges. I took only what could not be reissued: Derek's letters, the hospital bracelet from Lydia's birth, and the small seashell she once pressed into my palm when she was 6, saying, "This is for luck." When I closed the door behind me, I felt the faint satisfaction of finishing a sentence that had lingered too long. The bus to the new town rattled through the dark, passing fields that looked silver in the moonlight. For the first time in years, I wasn't heading toward or away from anyone. I was simply moving. The new apartment smelled of paint and carnations from the shop below. I spent the first morning watching pedestrians from the window, inventing lives for them. The woman with the red scarf was escaping a marriage. The man with the newspaper was pretending to read so he wouldn't have to think. In their anonymity, I found comfort. No one here knew I was the mother of a woman who had rewritten a ghost into existence. No one here would ask for Derek's name. I unpacked the typewriter, set it on the small table near the window, and began again. The first sentence I typed was, "When your own child edits you, the only response is authorship." I smiled at the sound of it. The words didn't heal, but they hummed. Weeks passed. Lydia didn't call. The silence that once gnawed now began to taste like space. I walked daily to the bakery across the street, where the owner, an old Italian man, saved the end pieces of bread for me. I told him they were my favorite because they looked like survivors, crusty and overlooked. He laughed and said I reminded him of his mother. Perhaps that was enough, to be mistaken for someone loved. In the evenings, I wrote until my fingers ached. I didn't think about whether anyone would ever read it. The act itself was the defense, the proof that I existed outside her footnotes. Still, there were moments when the ache returned, soft but insistent. One afternoon, a letter arrived without a return address. Inside was a photograph of Lydia at some event, smiling under chandeliers, her hand on a man's arm who wasn't her husband. On the back, a single line in an unfamiliar script. Everyone revises something. There was no signature. I burned the photo in the sink, watching the smile curl into smoke. Whoever sent it meant to wound, but I only felt weary curiosity. The world was full of editors. I was simply the first to notice. It was during one of those long, slow evenings that I realized how far the distance had stretched between the woman I'd been and the one sitting now at this window. I thought of Derek again, not as husband or saint, but as witness, and I wondered whether he'd approve of this quiet rebellion. In one of his letters, he'd written, "The hardest truth is that we survive not out of loyalty, but out of unfinished business." Perhaps that was what I was doing, finishing the business of being alive on my own terms. The gulls outside had given way to pigeons, the sea smell to the sweet rot of flowers. I missed the sound of waves, but not enough to go back. When the clock struck midnight, I opened the folder and added another page, the words flowing steady, as if my fingers were remembering a language they had once spoken fluently. You can't unbury the dead by writing their names, but you can bury a lie by telling it too often. The trick is to choose what deserves the grave. When I finally turned off the lamp, I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, just a strange equilibrium, the balance of a scale that has stopped pretending one side weighs more than the other. I realized then that the quiet worsening had done its work. The life I had known was gone, but so was the fear of losing it again. I closed my eyes and slept the kind of sleep that arrives only when you have finally accepted that no one is coming to correct your story, but you. It was in that small apartment above the florist, 3 months after I left the harbor, that something inside me began to shift in ways I could not yet name. It started with a sound. The repetitive clack of the shop door below as customers entered, the soft jingle of a bell that seemed to announce not only their arrival, but also the persistence of life in all its small, fragrant transactions. The smell. I had grown accustomed to the solitude, to the strange freedom of being unobserved, and yet, one afternoon, while watering the plant I had bought from the florist out of guilt, I caught my reflection in the window and realized I looked alert again. It wasn't youth. It was a kind of readiness, the quiet coiling of a will that had been dormant for decades. Something in me whispered that I had stopped running from Lydia's betrayal and had begun instead to circle around it, studying its architecture, preparing to take it apart brick by brick. I suppose the true beginning of that shift came the day I returned to the courthouse to request my own copy of the amended birth record. I told myself it was for closure, though I knew it was also for proof. Proof that my memory had not hallucinated the emptiness of the father's line. Proof that I had not imagined the feeling of a nurse's pity. Proof that the world could still contain an unaltered fact. The clerk this time was a woman with an expression of perpetual caution, as though the years had trained her to expect complaint. She brought me into a side office and handed me the record in a thin plastic sleeve, explaining I could not remove it, but could read it there. I looked down at the neat blue letters. Derek Ainsley, written as cleanly as though the ink had been waiting all this time for someone bold enough to use it. I asked if the supporting documentation was attached, and she said no, that only the amendment note remained in the file. There's an authorization form, she added, signed by your daughter. I asked to see it, and she hesitated, then turned the page toward me. There it was, Lydia's signature. Sharp, businesslike, confident. A mirror image of mine before arthritis softened it. I noticed, though, that in the line marked reason for correction, she had written one word. Restoration. Restoration. The audacity of that choice nearly made me laugh. To her, perhaps, the past was a damaged painting that needed to be retouched, and she, with her career polish and her careful smile, believed herself the restorer. To me, it was a fresco crumbling precisely because it had been overpainted too many times by those afraid of what the original face might reveal. I thanked the clerk and left the office feeling strangely light, as though I had been handed not a confirmation of deceit, but a map. The next bus didn't arrive for an hour, so I sat on the courthouse steps and watched people pass. Lawyers, clerks, mothers holding children by the wrist. And I realized how many stories walk into buildings like this and emerge altered by stamps and signatures. I thought about how many women like me had lived their lives inside the margins of official truth, our realities footnoted or erased by the tidy logic of forms. For the first time, I stopped seeing myself as a victim of Lydia's revision and began to recognize the larger inheritance. Generations of women corrected by the polite handwriting of others. The recognition didn't sting. It steadied me. That night, I wrote until dawn. I did not write about Lydia or Derek, not directly, but about the women I'd known, the neighbor who pretended her bruises came from the laundry line, the teacher who quit her job when she was pregnant because it would be easier for everyone, the cousin. I wrote them back into their own existence, letter by letter, until my hands trembled. The typewriter keys left faint bruises on my fingertips, small, dark moons of evidence. At sunrise, I stepped to the window and watched the street wake, and I thought, absurdly, that if truth had a sound, it would be the soft metallic clatter of those keys, a noise persistent enough to survive being ignored. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of small awakenings. I began to take coffee at the cafe across the square, where an old man played chess with himself and greeted everyone as if they were returning soldiers. The waitress, a girl with red hair and the gentle impatience of youth, began saving the corner table for me. She called me Miss Eleanor, which I didn't correct, because formality is a kind of respect seldom given to the elderly. I found myself speaking to her about ordinary things, the weather, her exams, the flowers downstairs, and realizing that conversation, too, could be restorative if stripped of pretense. One more, we talked while he worked. Nothing personal at first, just the business of pipes and weather. But after a while, he asked if I had family nearby. I said yes and no at the same time, which made him laugh. Then, almost without planning it, I told him about Lydia's amendment. He didn't interrupt or offer pity. He simply listened with the patience of someone accustomed to the slow unfolding of roots. When I finished, he said, "People think paper can fix what time broke, but time doesn't read." That sentence stayed with me. For the first time in months, I felt seen not as a relic, but as a witness. Later that evening, I sat at the window with a glass of sherry and considered his words. I realized that in all my anger toward Lydia, I had never asked myself what I wanted beyond being right. The revelation was quiet, but devastating. Being right was not enough. I wanted to reclaim not only the record but the narrative, to live in a story where my choices, my mistakes, and my endurance were mine alone. The more I thought of it, the more the idea of confrontation shifted in tone, from vengeance to clarity. I no longer wished to accuse Lydia. I wished to tell her face to face that I understood the fear behind her falsification. I told her I had moved, that I was writing something she might someday need to read, that I would be here if she ever wanted to talk about Derek without the shadow of his name. I did not mention the amended record. I sealed the letter and walked it to the post office myself. As I dropped it into the slot, I felt a tremor of hesitation. Was I reopening a wound or offering it clean air? But it was too late for indecision. The act itself felt like a hinge, turning me from passive endurance toward deliberate waiting. Weeks passed with no reply, but the absence no longer ached. It simply existed, like background music. I filled the space with the discipline of living, tending to the plant, which stubbornly refused to die, sharing coffee with the waitress who now called me our writer, and helping Martin arrange flowers for funerals when his assistant fell ill. I found that handling blooms destined for grief taught me more about grace than any sermon. Each bouquet had to be balanced, color against color, weight against stem, until it could stand as a small argument against finality. I began to see the same principle in my own life, the balance between truth and tenderness, between solitude and the small, stubborn human need to be understood. One evening, after helping Martin close the shop, I noticed a young couple outside arguing softly. The woman's face was flushed, her hands twisting the strap of her bag. The man looked helpless, defensive. I couldn't hear their words, but I recognized the rhythm of misunderstanding, the ache of two people trying to translate feelings into language that always arrives a sentence too late. Watching them, I felt an unexpected sympathy for Lydia. Perhaps her falsification had been her way of smoothing over a misunderstanding too large for speech. Perhaps she had rewritten Derek's name, not to erase me, but to stabilize herself, to anchor her identity to a certainty she could display without shame. The thought didn't excuse her, but it humanized her in a way that softened my anger. For the first time, I saw her not as an adversary, but as a frightened curator of her own fragility. That night, I pulled out the typewriter again and began a new section of my manuscript, titled Restoration. In it, I wrote not about facts, but about forgiveness, or rather, the possibility of it, the kind that doesn't demand apology, but recognizes shared imperfection. I described how, in the act of falsifying history, my daughter had revealed her inheritance of my own cowardice, how she had simply chosen a cleaner method of hiding what I once concealed in silence. I wrote that perhaps we were both guilty of wanting our stories to look neat from a distance. The more I wrote, the less angry I felt, and the more I began to understand the peculiar mercy of acknowledgement. To see someone clearly is not the same as absolving them, but it is the beginning of peace. When I finally stopped typing, the room was filled with the soft hum of the florist's refrigerator downstairs, keeping the flowers alive through the night. I listened to that steady vibration and thought how strange it was that preservation always requires cold. Yet in that chill, something warm stirred in me, a fragile, unfamiliar hope. Maybe Lydia would never respond. Maybe she would continue to live inside her curated narrative, but I had begun to live outside of it, breathing air unfiltered by her definitions. That realization, quiet and steady, was the midpoint of my story, the moment when survival stopped being a defense and became a choice. I went to bed that night not feeling victorious, but aligned, as if some long, misaligned bone in my soul had finally clicked into place, painful and necessary and right. It was late November when her handwriting returned to me, unexpected, almost shy, on the corner of an envelope that had no return address, but bore her precision in the way the letters leaned forward, as though even her name wanted to arrive ahead of itself. For a long time, I didn't open it. It sat on the kitchen table among the newspapers I used to keep the drafts of my writing from sliding, a small white island of anticipation. The florist downstairs had begun selling wreaths, and the air in my apartment smelled faintly of pine resin and candle wax. The world outside was preparing for holidays, for reunion and warmth. And I felt the cruel humor of receiving my daughter's silence, wrapped finally in paper, just as the town decorated itself with lights. I thought of all the years when we had written each other only as necessity, birthday cards, thank you notes, and wondered if this letter would contain the same economical tenderness, the sort that spares feeling for the sake of style. I opened it on the third day, not because curiosity won, but because patience had begun to taste too much like fear. Inside, a single page. The ink was black, the tone careful, the kind of voice people use when they are composing a statement for public release rather than speaking from the gut. She wrote that she had received my letter, that she was glad I was well, that she had been thinking a great deal about the past, and then, almost casually, that she would be in my town on business and hoped we might meet for lunch. The words were arranged to appear warm, but I could feel the starch in them. Still, the invitation itself was something I hadn't expected. I read the letter twice, then folded it back into its envelope as though folding it might make the sincerity inside expand. For the next week, I rehearsed the encounter, like an old actress returning to a role she had once played with conviction, but no longer believed in. What should I wear? How should I greet her? Would I mention Derek's name, or would I let her keep it embalmed in official blue ink? I polished my shoes, ironed my best blouse, and told myself not to expect revelation. The morning of our meeting, a pale fog lay over the square like a veil, softening every outline. I chose a corner table at the cafe, the same one where I wrote my letters. When she arrived, I knew her immediately, though her hair had turned a shade lighter, and her clothes looked like they had been chosen for a magazine rather than a meeting with her mother. She kissed my cheek with that careful air of someone performing affection for an invisible camera. We spoke first of ordinary things: her children, her husband's promotion, the renovations to their house. I nodded, asked questions, smiled when appropriate. She looked around occasionally, as if afraid to be recognized, which struck me as absurd in this small town, where anonymity was the only luxury we had left. When the coffee arrived, I decided to stop pretending. I told her I had read the amended record, that I had seen the word restoration. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she set her cup down with such precision that I could almost hear the sound of control tightening. "Mother," she said, "please don't make a scene." I laughed softly. The idea of me making a scene in a cafe that smelled of burnt milk was almost comic. I told her there would be no scene, only conversation. I asked her to explain what exactly she had hoped to restore. She stared at her reflection in the window as she spoke. "I wanted to make things right," she said finally. "You've spent your whole life living under a shadow, and I thought maybe, if I fix the record, it would give us both some dignity." The phrasing was clinical, the reasoning absurd. "You mean your dignity," I said quietly. "You wanted a clean line, no gaps, no shame, a father where one was missing." She shook her head, her earrings flashing. "That's not fair. You never told me the truth about that year. You kept everything secret." I was tired of not knowing which parts were lies. Her voice trembled, not with guilt, but with the fatigue of someone defending a fragile narrative. "So you replaced uncertainty with fiction," I said. "You buried a question under a forged answer." She reached across the table then, her hand hovering over mine, and said something I hadn't expected. "Maybe I just wanted to believe that I came from something whole." That word, whole, landed in me like a nail. I wanted to tell her that wholeness is a myth, that people are mosaics held together by invisible glue, but she looked so brittle, so terrified of fracture, that I couldn't. Instead, I asked, "And what of me? Where do I fit in this restoration of yours?" She hesitated, then said, "You fit wherever you've always been, Mother. You're the one who held everything together. I wanted to scream that I had held it together precisely because I was excluded from the picture, but I didn't. I just looked at her and saw, for the first time, not a woman who betrayed me, but a child who had never forgiven me for surviving without permission. We parted politely, as if the conversation had been an interview that went slightly off topic. She hugged me, too briefly, and said she would call. I watched her walk away down the street, heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks to a story I hadn't written. For a long time I sat there, the coffee cold, the fog dissolving into light rain. I realized I had not cried once. Something colder than grief had taken its place, a lucidity that felt almost architectural. She had not come to apologize. She had come to test whether I was still the pliable mother who could be rearranged to fit her decor. And I, against all my instincts, had remained calm enough to see her clearly. That was its own kind of triumph, though it tasted bitter. The next weeks were filled with an uneasy quiet. Lydia sent a text now and then, short, logistical, the digital equivalent of breathing without speaking. I replied when courtesy demanded it. But inside me, something continued to tighten. One evening, I received a message from an unknown number. You might want to ask your daughter about the Ainsley Estate Fund. There was no signature. I ignored it at first, dismissing it as spam or mischief. But the next morning, curiosity, or perhaps instinct, made me search Derek's name online. I discovered a recent charity foundation launched under his name, the Derek Ainsley Initiative for Professional Integrity, chaired by Lydia. The press release described her as continuing her father's legacy of ethical excellence. I stared at the screen, numb. Not content with resurrecting him on paper, she had now built an altar to his invented virtue. I printed the article and brought it to the florist's shop. Martin listened as I read it aloud, his hands buried in a bucket of chrysanthemums. When I finished, he said only, "She's still trying to prove she comes from something that can't die." I told him that perhaps she had succeeded. She had turned deceit into a monument. He shook his head. "You can't build integrity on a ghost." His words should have comforted me, but instead they sharpened my resolve. I knew then that silence was no longer a virtue. It was complicity. I had spent my life mistaking endurance for wisdom. It was time to correct that error. The following week, I requested an appointment with a solicitor recommended by the florist's cousin. His office was small, the walls lined with shelves of thick binders that smelled of dust and persistence. I explained everything: the original record, the amendment, the public use of Derek's name, my daughter's authorization. The solicitor, a patient man with weary eyes, listened without interruption. When I finished, he asked gently, "What is it you want to achieve, Mrs. Ainsley?" The question startled me because I hadn't named it even to myself. I looked at the papers spread before us and said, "I want the truth to have the same authority as her lie." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll file an affidavit with supporting documents. It won't erase her version, but it will stand beside it. Parallel truths. The law allows that." I signed the forms with a steadiness that surprised me. The pen didn't shake. Afterward, walking home, I passed a shop window displaying typewriters like the one I used. I stopped to look at my reflection, superimposed over the rows of black keys, and realized I no longer resembled the woman who had once believed that love required silence. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clear. And for a moment I thought I saw Derek's reflection, beside mine, not as apparition, but as memory's echo, nodding slightly, as if to say, "Finally." When Lydia called that evening, her voice was clipped. I'm only. If you. Nothing was stolen, but the drawers where I kept Derek's letters had been opened. The folder marked unedited lay on the floor, its pages scattered. I gathered them slowly, reading fragments as I went. Sentences about honesty, about inheritance, about the small violences of omission. Whoever had been there had left no trace but disarray, yet I understood perfectly who it was meant to silence. I didn't call the police. I simply locked the door and sat in the dark until morning. The papers spread around me like a paper graveyard. That night, paper lasts longer. I thanked him, though I knew both fade if neglected. Each act of duplication felt like defiance, a way to multiply my existence until erasure became impossible. I sent a copy of the affidavit to Lydia by registered mail with a note that said only, "Truth is not a threat. It's a foundation." She didn't reply, but 2 days later, her husband called, his tone low and urgent. "Please, Eleanor," he said. "She's not well. She feels you're attacking her." I told him that perhaps for once she should feel what truth feels like when it doesn't flatter. He sighed, thanked me for listening, and hung up. December settled over the town with the weight of damp wool. The lights in the square blinked uncertainly, half of them burned out. I spent Christmas Eve alone, writing by candlelight because the power flickered with the storm. I wrote not for Lydia anymore, but for the women who would come after me, the ones who might one day find themselves erased in more sophisticated ways. I wrote, "When they rewrite you, do not correct them. Write yourself louder. Every silence is an invitation for someone else's fiction." The words came easily, as if they had been waiting behind the dam of years. In the first week of January, I received a formal letter from the registrar's office confirming that my affidavit had been accepted into the permanent archive. My version of events, authenticated, cataloged, official. The letter ended with a line I found unintentionally poetic. "This record will remain in perpetuity unless otherwise amended by court order." I smiled at the irony. Perpetuity is always conditional. Still, it was enough. For the first time, I felt that my name and my truth could coexist in the same sentence without apology. A few days later, Lydia appeared at my door without warning. She looked thinner, her eyes shadowed. In her hands, a box. She said nothing as she stepped inside, set the box on the table, and opened it. Inside were Derek's letters, the originals I thought she might have taken that night. "I didn't read them," she said. "I just wanted to see if you'd notice." Her voice was low, stripped of its usual polish. "I did notice," I said. "That's why I made copies." She nodded, almost approvingly. "You always were thorough." For a moment we stood in silence, the distance between us filled with the ghosts of all the words we hadn't said. Then she whispered, "I don't know how to undo what I've done." I looked at her and answered, "You don't. You just stop pretending it never happened." She began to cry again, quietly, the way children do when they finally understand the cost of pretending. When she left, the air in the apartment felt lighter, though the smell of her perfume lingered like a question. I watched from the window as she walked away, slower this time, unguarded. The snow had begun to fall, soft and relentless, erasing the footprints almost as soon as they appeared. I thought of Derek's line in one of his letters. "Snow doesn't hide, it renews." I whispered it to the glass and felt something shift inside me again. Not closure, not forgiveness, but a steadier pulse. I had not destroyed my daughter, nor had I saved her. I had simply refused to vanish. That, I decided, was enough. The morning she died was bright, a cruel kind of brightness that made every color look overconfident, as if the world had no memory of sorrow. But I didn't know it yet when the call came, only that the voice on the other end, Tom's voice, sounded wrong, too careful, as though he were stepping barefoot through broken glass. "She's gone, Eleanor," he said. And for a moment I didn't know who she was, because I had trained myself for so long to live without the daily weight of her name. "An accident," he added, and then the words blurred into static. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, the silence thickening into meaning. It wasn't disbelief that came first, but recognition, the way you recognize the sound of a door closing that you yourself once opened. The police would later say it was a highway collision, a misjudged lane change, no alcohol, no mystery, just speed and exhaustion. But I have lived long enough to know that very few accidents are without preface. I didn't cry that day, nor the next. Grief behaves differently after a certain age. It no longer floods but condenses, turning to a fine mist that coats everything you touch. I went about the small rituals of propriety, phone calls, condolences, practicalities, because that is what mothers are trained to do. Manage the aftermath as if sorrow were an administrative task. Tom said the service would be private in the city, just family. I said that was fine. He didn't know what to say to me, and I didn't require him to. When I hung up, I turned to the window and watched the florist downstairs arranging lilies in a tall glass vase. They looked too white, too fragile. I remembered how Lydia had once called lilies the flowers of pretension, and the absurd thought made me laugh until the laughter cracked. 2 days later, I traveled to the city by train. The seat beside me was empty, and in the reflection of the glass, I saw my face suspended against the rushing landscape, a ghost following its own body. At the funeral, the hall was filled with polished strangers who spoke of her as though they were describing a portrait rather than a woman. Words like accomplished, devoted, visionary floated through the air, harmless as confetti. They spoke of the foundation she had created, the lives she had touched, her unwavering sense of integrity. I listened to them and realized that the fiction had won its final applause. On the program, beneath her photograph, was the line, "Daughter of the late Derek and Eleanor Ainsley." The blue ink had followed her even here, immortalizing the correction. I felt the old fury rise, but it dissolved into something quieter, almost pity. Let it stand, I thought. Let her rest inside the story she built. She was always building toward it. After the ceremony, Tom approached me with the hesitance of a man afraid of both truth and kindness. "She wanted you to have this," he said, handing me a sealed envelope. "She gave it to me a few weeks ago, told me to send it if anything happened." I took it without speaking, feeling its weight like a heartbeat. Back in my hotel room, I laid it on the table and stared at it for an hour before opening it. Inside was a letter, written in her precise hand but unguarded, almost trembling. "Mother," it began, "by the time you read this, I may already have made another mistake. I don't know how to carry what I've done. I've tried to fix it, but every fix just built another lie. I thought success would erase the gaps in my story, but it only made them louder. I've told the lawyers to dissolve the foundation and return the funds to the hospital where Father was treated. His name belongs there, not on a brochure. I know you filed your affidavit. You were right to. It made me angry, but it also made me proud. I wanted to be as brave as you once were. but I only learned how to imitate bravery. Forgive me if you can. If not, at least keep writing. It's the only honest thing either of us ever did. The letter ended without signature, only a smudge where her pen must have paused. I sat for a long time, tracing the indentations her hand had left in the paper. It was the first true confession she had ever given me, and it arrived too late to be answered. That night, I dreamed of her as a child again, sitting on the kitchen floor drawing suns on the backs of envelopes. In the dream, she looked up and said, "I'll make everything bright." And I wanted to tell her that brightness is only beautiful when it knows its shadow. I woke before I could speak. The next morning, I returned to my apartment by the sea. The florist had left a bouquet of violets at my door with a note. For Lydia and for you. I placed them on the table beside her letter. For a week, I barely moved. Grief is strange. It rewrites your understanding of betrayal. I began to see that what I had long called cruelty in her was, perhaps, a distorted form of love, one that had never found a language gentle enough to survive translation. I told him I wanted to add an amendment. He raised an eyebrow, perhaps remembering the old woman with the trembling hands who had once demanded her record be restored, and asked what kind. "A statement of reconciliation," I said. "Not to replace anything, only to accompany it." He nodded, pulled out the forms, and watched as I wrote in slow, deliberate script. The record of fact stands as filed. But between fact and forgiveness, there exists a space where both may rest without contradiction. I signed it, dated it, and felt an unexpected calm settle in my chest, the kind that comes not from resolution, but from having exhausted all need for it. When I stepped outside, the sky had begun to change, the light softening into that tender hour when the sea mirrors everything without judgment. I walked to the edge of the pier and took the letter from my coat pocket. The wind tried to pull it away, but I held fast, reading one last time the sentence that had undone me. Keep writing. It's the only honest thing either of us ever did. I whispered back, "Then I will." And with that, I let the paper go. It fluttered once, twice, then drifted down to the water, dissolving into the same tide that had once carried Derek's ashes. The symmetry was almost too perfect, but grief has a taste for poetry, and I allowed it this indulgence. In the week, I wrote about the widow who rewrote her own obituary to include laughter, about the mother who kept her child secret because love demanded silence, about the daughter who forged her father's name, and the mother who forgave her. Each story bled into the next until they formed a single thread, a quiet testament to the persistence of female memory. I sent the manuscript to a small local press under a pseudonym. I didn't care if it was published. The act of sending it was the culmination, the final declaration that I was no longer content to be the footnote to someone else's version. Sometimes, when I walk by the sea at dusk, I imagine Lydia walking beside me. Not the polished woman from the magazine photos, but the child who once hid behind my legs at the sound of thunder. I tell her about the gulls, about the florist who still asks after her, about how the world keeps turning even when no one's looking. I tell her that I have kept her letter, though the ink is fading, and that I understand now that love, like truth, can exist even when it fails to save us. And in those moments, the distance between us feels less like loss and more like horizon, something unreachable but always visible. I suppose that is what the end of a story feels like when it refuses to be tragic. There is no justice, no vengeance, only the fragile satisfaction of having spoken without fear. The harbor still smells of salt and rain, and the gulls still argue over invisible spoils. Sometimes the florist leaves a single lily at my door, not out of pity, but because he knows I prefer white to color now. I take it, place it in a glass of water, and watch it open slowly, its petals deliberate, unashamed of their perfection. It reminds me that even beauty, when honest, doesn't apologize for what it has survived. When I think of Lydia now, I no longer see the line on the certificate or the falsified ink. I see the woman who tried, in her flawed way, to restore what she thought was broken. I see the child drawing suns. I see the mother she might have been, if life had granted her the patience to wait for truth to ripen, instead of forcing it into bloom. And I see myself, an old woman who has finally learned that forgiveness is not a gesture offered to the dead, but a permission granted to the living. To keep walking, to keep writing, to keep existing in the unedited version of one's own story. That night, before sleep, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line. Every correction is a confession. Then I closed it, turned off the lamp, and listened to the sea carrying away the sound of my breath, steady and unafraid. In the months after everything settled into its final shape, I found that the world did not become kinder or sharper, only legible, and that legibility, more than joy or sorrow, is what allows an old woman to carry her life without flinching. The mornings began with the bell of the florist's door and the hiss of the kettle, the afternoons with a walk along the pier where the gulls rehearsed their petty arguments, and the evenings with a lamp angled toward paper, my pen stubbornly faithful. Even when my hand shook, and somewhere inside that ordinary procession, I realized the story no longer burned me from the inside, but warmed me like a stove that remembers its purpose after the fire is banked. I kept writing, not because I still needed to prove anything to Lydia or to the men and women who believed in the blue ink more than the living breath that contradicted it, but because the pages had become a place where my voice could sit without apology, and I discovered that voice is not a possession, but a room you clean and return to until it smells like soap and old wood, and you can find everything in the dark. I sent small pieces to the local paper under that same quiet pseudonym, and once, on a Thursday, saw my own sentences printed between an ad for roofing and the notice of a church bake sale, and I laughed, not with mockery, but with the recognition that history in this town was always a collage of the useful and the sincere. It surprised me how often people came into the shop asking for flowers for apologies they were too proud to make, and how the choice of stem betrayed them. Tulips for cowardice, roses for theater, violets for the unsayable. And when Martin let me help, on busy days I learned that arranging a bouquet is a cousin to making a life, because you keep moving things until the empty places look intentional, and the fragile things are protected without being hidden. And that, I decided, was the most I wanted. From the remainder of my time, intentional gaps and visible softness. Tom called sometimes, tentative but steady, and the children wrote me emails that tried to be breezy and failed charmingly. And once my granddaughter asked what her mother had meant by "keep writing," a question sent with the bravery of someone who has learned that love can survive an honest sentence, and I told her that writing is not magic, but it is a kind of stubborn kindness, because it refuses to let the untrue be the last word. And she wrote back a week later to say she had begun a notebook named After, and the title pleased me because it admitted that there had been a before. I came to understand that forgiveness, when it finally arrives, does not make a noise or a promise. It is the quiet competence with which you fold a shirt you once thought you would never wear again. The ease with which you throw open the window that once did as a judge or a witness, and I did not ask Lydia to explain herself to the air. I simply read a few lines from the stories I had been collecting and left them there like crumbs a bird might mistake for seed, trusting that even stray words find their way into a future that will need them. On the day Basad shelved a second in general nonfiction, a gesture so tender and ridiculous that I had to step outside and catch my breath. There are evenings when the light falters, and I feel the soft ache of all I could not fix, the harm that clung to Lydia's brightness, the blunt fact that truth did not save her from the physics of a highway, the knowledge that the affidavit and the amendment and my careful sentences will not prevent another woman from being corrected by a hand that prefers neatness to accuracy. And in those moments, I speak aloud to the room as if it were an audience of one, a woman standing in her own kitchen, with a letter she does not want to open, and I tell her that she is not crazy for thinking paper can bruise, that she is not disloyal for wanting to place her own name in her own story, that she is not selfish for refusing to be the uncredited scaffolding for someone else's polished courage, and that the act she is afraid of, writing the truth where anyone might find it, is not a fire set to the past, but a light left on for whoever comes home last. I know now that endings do not reward us with perfection. They grant us coherence, and coherence is the permission to sit still in the truth without hardening into it, to accept that the people we loved were not the ones we needed them to be, and that we ourselves were not as brave as the legend requires, and still to wake, tie on an apron at the shop, count change, tie ribbon, answer the bell, and return at dusk to the desk where the lamp remembers the shape of our hand. If you have read this far into the life of a woman you do not know, then perhaps you are the one I have been writing toward, the one who has been corrected so many times she is afraid to write in ink, the one who hesitates at the line marked father, or mother, or name, or home, because she has learned that forms are only hospitable to the uncomplicated. I am telling you that the truth you keep apologizing for is a house with a door that fits your key, and that no clerk, no child, no blue ink get to stand between you and that lock, and that if you are waiting for a sign that it is not too late to choose yourself, let this old woman's voice be it. Let the bell of the florist's door be it. Let the surf counting and recounting the shore be it. And when you are ready, sit down and write in your own hand the sentence no one else has the right to sign. Then say it out loud in the quiet room that will one day carry your breath into the next morning, steady and unafraid.